Richard thought he had successfully navigated the most difficult challenge a marriage could face. At 35, he believed he had made the mature, measured decision to forgive his 32-year-old wife Ella's infidelity and rebuild their relationship on stronger foundations. They had been together for 7 years, married for 5, and had seemingly overcome a betrayal that initially seemed like it would end their marriage forever. 2 years ago, Ella had confessed to cheating on Richard with a coworker. For someone who had always considered infidelity an absolute deal-breaker, this confession had shattered Richard's world and his understanding of their relationship. His initial reaction was swift and decisive. Divorce was the only option. Cheating was his red line, and Ella had crossed it. But relationships, especially long-term marriages, rarely offer simple solutions to complex problems. As Richard processed the betrayal, several factors began to influence his thinking and ultimately led him to reconsider his immediate impulse toward divorce. The first factor that gave Richard pause was how he had learned about the affair. Ella had confessed voluntarily, coming to him with tears and remorse rather than being caught and forced to admit her betrayal. In Richard's mind, this voluntary confession suggested genuine guilt and a desire to repair their relationship rather than simply getting caught in a lie. The second detail that influenced Richard's decision was the nature of the affair as Ella had described it. She claimed it was a single incident that occurred at a coworker's housewarming party. Richard remembered that night clearly. Ella hadn't returned home until 4 a.m., and he had sent several concerned texts checking on her welfare and offering to pick her up if needed. Ella typically didn't drink much, but occasionally succumbed to peer pressure in social situations, so Richard's concern that night had been about her safety rather than suspicion of infidelity. In his mind, a single drunken mistake, while still devastating, was potentially forgivable in a way that a calculated, ongoing affair would not be. Have you ever forgiven someone based on partial information only to discover the full truth later? How did that change your feelings about the situation? The third factor was Ella's immediate response to her confession. Without any prompting from Richard, she had quit her job to remove herself from the environment where the affair had occurred. This seemed to demonstrate genuine commitment to rebuilding trust and establishing better boundaries in her life. Richard had actually discouraged Ella from quitting her job at the time because he was still planning to divorce her and worried that her unemployment would result in higher alimony payments. Her willingness to sacrifice her career despite his discouragement seemed to indicate genuine remorse rather than calculated damage control. The fourth and perhaps most complex factor in Richard's decision-making process was his own history with infidelity. When he was 19, he had cheated on a girlfriend with a drunken kiss, and she had forgiven him. While Richard recognized that his youthful indiscretion was far less serious than Ella's full sexual encounter, he still felt somewhat hypocritical about his inability to extend the same forgiveness he had once received. Beyond these specific factors, Richard had to acknowledge that everything else in their relationship was exceptional. Ella was the most compatible person he had ever dated. Their personality match was nearly perfect, and the affair seemed to be completely out of character for the woman he had fallen in love with and married. Given all these considerations, Richard made what he believed was a mature, thoughtful decision to forgive Ella and work toward rebuilding their marriage. However, he wasn't naive about the challenges ahead, and he insisted on legal protection for himself in case future problems arose. What role should legal agreements play in marriage recovery after infidelity? Do postnups help or hurt the rebuilding process? The condition for Richard's forgiveness was Ella's agreement to sign a postnuptial agreement that will protect him financially if their reconciliation failed or if she cheated again. This wasn't about punishment. It was about ensuring that his decision to forgive didn't leave him vulnerable to additional financial harm if their marriage ultimately couldn't be saved. The postnup Richard proposed was carefully crafted and, in his view, fair rather than punitive. It included an infidelity clause specifying that any future cheating would result in the cheater forfeiting the jointly owned home, car, and any claim to alimony. Additionally, marital assets would be divided 60-40 in favor of the betrayed spouse rather than the typical 50-50 split. Ella had agreed to these terms enthusiastically, which Richard interpreted as evidence of her genuine commitment to their marriage and her confidence that she would never betray him again. Both parties had received independent legal advice during the drafting and signing process, ensuring that the agreement was fair and enforceable. For 2 years, this arrangement seemed to work perfectly. Richard and Ella had rebuilt their relationship, attended counseling, and appeared to have successfully navigated one of marriage's greatest challenges. Richard felt proud of his mature handling of the crisis and believed he had made the right choice in giving their marriage another chance. How do you rebuild trust when you discover that your partner's honesty was actually strategic deception? Is there a difference between lying and withholding information? But last month, Richard received a message that would completely upend his understanding of both the original affair and his decision to forgive it. Alice, the wife of Ella's affair partner, contacted him through Facebook after tracking him down through Ella's social media accounts. Alice had discovered her husband Bill's infidelity by going through his electronic devices and had uncovered evidence of his affair with Ella from 2 years earlier. She was reaching out to Richard to see if he knew about the affair and to understand how he and Ella had handled the situation in their marriage. Richard confirmed that he knew about the affair and explained that he and Ella had reconciled after working through the betrayal. Alice shared that she was planning to divorce Bill because, unlike Ella, Bill had proven to be a serial cheater who had never voluntarily confessed to any of his affairs. The conversation might have ended there, with two betrayed spouses comparing notes on their different approaches to similar crises. But Alice then revealed information that would fundamentally change Richard's understanding of everything that had happened 2 years ago. According to the evidence Alice had found on Bill's devices, the affair between Ella and Bill had lasted 5 months and involved more than 10 sexual encounters. This wasn't the single drunken mistake that Ella had confessed to. It was an extended, deliberate relationship that had required sustained deception and planning. Richard asked Alice to clarify whether she was referring to an emotional affair, hoping against hope that perhaps the physical component had indeed been limited to a single encounter. But Alice was clear. The evidence showed an ongoing physical relationship that had lasted months and involved numerous sexual encounters. The revelation hit Richard like a physical blow. Everything he thought he knew about Ella's betrayal had been built on a fundamental lie. The voluntary confession he had admired was actually a calculated partial truth designed to minimize her guilt while appearing honest. The single night of poor judgment he had eventually forgiven was actually months of deliberate choices to betray their marriage. Should the work done on a relationship after partial confession count for anything, or does discovering the full truth negate all progress made? When Richard confronted Ella with this new information, she immediately admitted to the truth. Her confession confirmed Alice's account. The affair had indeed lasted 5 months and involved multiple sexual encounters. The story of a single drunken mistake had been a carefully constructed lie designed to make her betrayal seem forgivable. Richard demanded to know why Ella had lied to him, and her answer was devastatingly honest. She didn't believe he would have forgiven her if he had known the full truth. In her mind, the partial confession was a strategic decision to preserve their marriage while minimizing the consequences of her actions. Ella's attempts to defend her deception only made Richard more angry and disillusioned. She argued that since they had made 2 years of progress together, it shouldn't matter whether the affair was once or 10 times. She maintained that her confession, even if incomplete, had shown true remorse and commitment to their relationship. But Richard saw the situation very differently. In his view, Ella's omission revealed that even in her moment of supposed honesty and remorse, her primary concern had been protecting herself rather than respecting him enough to let him make a fully informed decision about their marriage. The deception felt almost as bad as the original betrayal because it had robbed Richard of his agency in deciding how to respond to his wife's infidelity. He had made his forgiveness decision based on incomplete and misleading information, which meant his choice hadn't been truly his own. Richard now found himself in the painful position of reconsidering a decision he had spent 2 years believing was mature and wise. The forgiveness he had extended was based on a lie, which meant the entire foundation of their reconciliation was false. The postnup that had seemed like a reasonable precaution now looked like prescient protection. Richard was strongly considering divorce, and the financial terms they had agreed to 2 years earlier would provide him with a more favorable settlement than he would have received otherwise. When Ella suggested returning to couples therapy to work through this new crisis, Richard struggled to see how that could be effective. How do you rebuild trust with someone when your current level of trust is actually lower than it was immediately after their original betrayal? The therapeutic work they had done over the past 2 years had been built on the premise that Ella had made a single, serious mistake and was genuinely committed to transparency and change. Now Richard knew that even her confession had been calculated and self-serving, which undermined everything they thought they had accomplished together. Professional counselors often emphasize that successful recovery from infidelity requires complete honesty from the cheating partner. The betrayed spouse needs to understand the full scope of the betrayal in order to make informed decisions about their future and to properly process their emotions and trauma. Ella's strategic partial confession had violated this fundamental principle of affair recovery. By controlling the narrative and limiting Richard's access to the full truth, she had continued to manipulate their relationship even while appearing to take responsibility for her actions. The revelation also highlighted how affairs often involve multiple layers of betrayal beyond the sexual component. There's the initial betrayal of the affair itself, followed by the ongoing deception required to maintain it, and finally, the lies told during confession to minimize consequences while appearing honest. Richard's situation demonstrated how partial truths can be more damaging to long-term relationship recovery than complete lies. At least with outright lies, there's clear deception to confront and work through. Partial truths create a false foundation of trust that can collapse when the full story eventually emerges. The timing of Richard's discovery, 2 years after their reconciliation, also created unique challenges. They had built what seemed like a stronger marriage based on incomplete information, which meant that all their progress was potentially meaningless if it was based on continued deception. Richard's consideration of divorce wasn't just about the original affair anymore. It was about Ella's continued willingness to prioritize her own comfort over his right to make informed decisions about their marriage. Even in her moment of honesty, she had been dishonest. The postnup that Richard had insisted on 2 years earlier now provided him with options he wouldn't have had otherwise. The infidelity clause would give him significant financial advantages in a divorce, which felt appropriate given that Ella's deception had violated the spirit of their reconciliation agreement, even if not its letter. Ella's argument that the time elapsed and progress made should outweigh the significance of her original deception revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of trust and honesty in relationships. Trust isn't just about future behavior. It's also about having accurate information about past behavior to make informed decisions. Richard's struggle with how to proceed reflected the complexity of situations where betrayal is discovered in layers over time. Each new revelation doesn't just add to the original hurt, it calls into question everything that has happened since and undermines confidence in the betraying partner's capacity for genuine honesty. The involvement of Alice in revealing the truth also highlighted how affairs often have consequences that extend far beyond the original participants. Richard's marriage was being affected by Bill's inability to be honest with his own wife, demonstrating how deception creates ripple effects that can emerge years later. For couples attempting to recover from infidelity, Richard and Ella's story serves as a cautionary tale about the absolute necessity of complete honesty during confession. Half-truths and strategic omissions may seem like they're protecting the relationship, but they actually undermine any possibility of genuine reconciliation. Richard's current dilemma, whether to attempt rebuilding trust from an even lower starting point or to end a marriage that may have been built on a foundation of lies, reflects the devastating long-term consequences of incomplete honesty after betrayal. The question of whether Richard should try to trust Ella again involves assessing not just her original affair, but her continued willingness to manipulate truth when it serves her interests. After 2 years of believing he had forgiven a single mistake, Richard was discovering he had actually forgiven only part of a much larger betrayal. The postnup they had signed was designed to protect Richard from future infidelity, but it had also inadvertently protected him from the consequences of Ella's past dishonesty about the scope of her betrayal. What had seemed like excessive caution 2 years ago now looked like necessary wisdom. Richard's story reminds us that forgiveness based on incomplete information isn't really forgiveness at all. It's a decision made under false pretenses that can be reconsidered when the full truth emerges. The question now was whether their marriage could survive not just the original betrayal, but the discovery that their entire reconciliation had been built on continued deception.